Hello, I'm Martin Jaffe of the Jackson School of International Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to our program today, Midrash in the Humanities. My guest is David Stern of the University of Pennsylvania, who for 1992 is the Strom Visiting Professor of Jewish Studies here at the University of Washington. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you. David is author of a new book, an important book in Midrashic studies called Parables in Midrash, recently published by Harvard University Press. And I thought it might be a good idea to ask him to expand on some of the themes that are addressed in that book for an audience that may not be overly familiar with Midrashic literature in general and the way Midrashic literature is studied in the contemporary university. So I think the best place to begin is at the very beginning and to ask the simple question is what we mean by Midrash. And I wonder if you could sort of help explain what this term means in traditional Jewish learning and the way it's used in modern research.
Fine. Well, Midrash is essentially the way the rabbis, as the Jewish sages lived in the land of Israel in the first 5-6 centuries of the Common Era, the way these rabbis studied the Bible. The word Midrash itself means, for the rabbis, study. We tend to call it interpretation, but it's the way in which they read and understood the Bible. That's the primary sense of the word Midrash. It also, as we know it, is the literature that this activity of study produced. And the literature was probably originally an oral literature. It was something that the rabbis recited orally, taught orally. They preached in sermons, taught it in schools. And at some point, these interpretations, which were probably also passed on orally, were then written down and eventually made into collections of interpretations.
How were these Midrashic interpretations written down? Did people write extensive essays about biblical books?
No. The interpretations which were written down really come to us. They're preserved in collections. But they really come to us in what looks much more like notes. They're elliptical, they're very sparse, they're often not fleshed out, and they're very fragmentary. They say that they take a word in the Bible and then they offer an interpretation. Most frequently they offer not one, but numbers of interpretations for the same verse, word, or phrase.
So what you would have in a Midrashic book would be a biblical verse and a series of rabbinic interpretations. And then the next verse and interpretation.
Exactly.
So was this a common mode of interpreting the Bible in the ancient world, in the ancient Jewish world?
It's not unparalleled. That is that it has resemblances to certain types of interpretations that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's certain type of Christian commentaries that resemble Midrash in this sort of mode, though the actual literary forms of Midrash, like the parable, the stories that they tell, the various little mini-sermons that you find, are all really quite unique to Midrash, and they really require understanding on their own terms.
So you see Midrash as really something distinctive to the rabbis?
Yes.
Although it might have parallels and antecedents and analogies in other Jewish and even non-Jewish literatures of the ancient world, Midrash is distinctively rabbinic.
Yes, as I use the term.
Well,
I mean, it's one way of studying the Bible. Yeah. The rabbis aren't the only people to study the Bible. They're not the only Jews to study the Bible that way. They're certainly not the only religious groups in the ancient world to study the Bible. And each one of these groups really produces its own type of exegetical interpretive literature.
Well, are you in particular comfortable with using the term Midrash to apply to non-rabbinic kinds of writing? Like, for example, often you read in scholarship, you read about a Christian Midrash on such and such a book of the Bible, or something of that kind, or even Philo is sometimes talked about as if he was writing a Midrashic commentary to this or that book. Are you comfortable with that term?
I don't think it's helpful. Well, in the first place, I prefer to use more words than few words. So I'd rather keep Midrash to the rabbis and call other types of interpretations by their own names.
Okay. One last question while we're on this this basic topic. Where do you stand on the question of whether the Midrashic literature is somehow analogous to creative literature that we might find in the contemporary period? Some people...
In our world?
In our world, yeah. There's the notion that Midrash is the repository of rabbinic imagination, that the stories that we find in Midrash are, in some sense, analogous to the fictions that contemporary authors might write, and so on and so forth. Do you find that a helpful comparison, or is there are there things we might be cautious about in these kinds of comparisons? Where do you stand on those kinds of questions?
It's a complicated question. Midrash definitely is one repository of the rabbinic imagination, and there are certain features of Midrash which do very much resemble certain types of literature, contemporary literature, especially truly contemporary, that is, say, postmodernist literature. Mm-hmm. One of the hallmarks of Midrash is the way in which it uses stories to solve problems of interpretation in the biblical text. An unusual word, that is to say, a word which the rabbis don't quite know exactly what it means, or which calls itself to their attention in one way or another, might produce, as its interpretation, a story, a narrative. And these narratives take off from the interpretation of the text. In the same way, very frequently, the interpretations that are not narrative these narratives tend to blur the line between commentary and text. This is a feature of Midrash which is very typical, where you're not actually sure where the commentary begins, as say where an interpretation of a more important text, in this case the Bible, begins, and where the Midrash seems to go off on its own and become its own little creation. That quality is very characteristic of a lot of postmodernist literature, which erases sort of the line between interpretation and text, or between criticism and literature. But
go ahead.
Even though that's characteristic, I'm not sure that it's very helpful to call postmodernist literature Midrash.
Or to argue that the rabbis had some kind of postmodern sensibility when it came to...
Yeah, and that certainly is not the case. It looks, what you're presented with is something that looks very much like something contemporary. And that's part of its fascination. But when you get down to study it deeply, you also begin to realize that there are real differences.
Well, how do you think...
There are real universals of the human imagination. I mean, that's also true.
Well, on this theme, just to push it a little longer, do you have any particular opinion about how you think perhaps the creators of Midrash understood the relationship between their contribution to the biblical text and the biblical text itself? Did they see themselves essentially as commentators to a text which had a fixed meaning, and they were explaining that meaning, or did they see the text as a jumping off point for their own particular work? How would you characterize their approach to the Bible? Again,
it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's difficult because they never tell us anything directly themselves. To answer the question, I think one first has to allow for the possibility that they would not even frame the question in the way that we frame it. For them, first of all, the Bible isn't simply a text, a fixed text, a dead, inert text that one then writes a commentary on in order to understand. For them, the Bible is God's Word. It's a word that's, well, one would say timeless, but timelessness isn't really the point. The point is that its meaning is for the present moment, that's say their present moment. And that's their very definition of what the Bible is. For them to be able to extend the Bible's meaning to its present, their moment, isn't doing for them any violence to the biblical text. They're actually fulfilling the Bible's mandate. They're actually doing what they believe the Bible wants them to do. So the question isn't really whether they see themselves extending the biblical text. The question is much more, I guess, how they would have imagined the different ways of extending the biblical text to differ from one another, how they would have seen their own role in doing that, questions of that sort. Exactly what they believe is very, very hard to say, and in certain ways, I mean, they believe like other people in the ancient world who seem to have larger terms of belief or larger references than we do today. I mean, they don't divide things into fact and fiction like two neat categories.
Well, that leads us to another interesting question. Maybe I'll try it out on you. When modern day scholars, whether they're in a religious tradition or an academic tradition, write a commentary on a biblical book, the tendency, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but the tendency is to say, well, the Bible has a particular meaning and this is what the meaning is. When you read a midrashic work, it's as has been noticed many times, I believe you even wrote on this topic, that one of the most infuriating or delightful things about midrash, depending on your point of view, is that often you get a series of interpretations to the same verse which have nothing to do with each other. And you're left wondering, well, what is the interpretation? Are they all true? Are you supposed to make a choice, have a vote, or whatever? What accounts for that tendency in midrashic literature to give multiple interpretations and not even to give the reader a hint as to which one to choose? What does that mean?
Okay, well, there's two actually separate matters there. One is the way in which these collections that we have that preserve midrash tend to record multiple interpretations. The other is the sheer fact of the question of whether or not there is one true interpretation. For the rabbis, the Bible isn't a text which is something in the past which has one meaning. It's a book which, by definition, holds a meaning for the present time. Since the present time changes, there's no question that the meanings are going to change. The whole point is not to be able to fix the meaning of the text. It's to be able to apply the text, to extend it, to use it, to make literally the text embrace every possible moment. And that's precisely, I think, the explanation for the multiple interpretations. The way they're actually preserved in these collections, without giving any preference, is revealing. And it's revealing, primarily of their overall belief in sort of the multiple possibilities of interpretation, of significances to the text. To what extent you want to take that fact that there's multiple interpretations and turn it into a kind of axiom is a separate matter. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Bible has an infinity of meanings. I'm not sure that that's really the case.
Although there are some statements in the rabbinic literature which suggest that there is a belief that the biblical text has an infinite variety of possible meanings. Or at least
70 meanings.
70 meanings.
Yeah, far from infinite.
Well, I suppose you're right.
But you can see, but the point is that if you look at individual rabbis, definitely have beliefs that their interpretations are right, other interpretations are wrong. There's that famous case in Exodus where I think the verse says, "Vayachasat Tzvardeya," where the frog covered
Was it one frog?
Egypt, and Akiba said there was one frog, this one humongous, gigantic frog that covered all of Egypt. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah thought this was ridiculous and said to Akiba, "Go back to your pollutions and tents, the ultimate
Something you know
curse, the
about.
study of purities and impurity." And he said, that's ridiculous what you said, Akiba. There was one frog that came, looked over Egypt, and then it whistled, and the other frogs came after it.
No.
So there you see a very clear difference of interpretation. And the point, that's a humorous example, but Rabbi Akiva's interpretation of that verse was for Eliezer ben Azariah ludicrous.
So there's quite ample evidence of disputes among the rabbis about concrete interpretation.
Oh, yeah. And I think what you have to do really, and this is something that really hasn't been done in the scholarship, is actually to go through a lot of midrash and just see what sort of actual choices, where all the cases where you can see the rabbis making a choice, choosing one interpretation over another interpretation, and asking what were their motivations in each case.
Interesting.
And they vary.
Well, sure, I would imagine.
Some of them are polemical, some of them are ideological, some of them are matters of taste.
Well, while we've begun to move a little bit further into the next topic, and maybe we can make the leap now. You come at a particular, your work and your interests come at a particular time in the history of what we would call academic or university Midrashic studies. And I would like to talk with you a little bit about what you see that some of the tasks of modern scholarship are in relationship to Midrash. Before we get there, perhaps it might be helpful to contextualize a little bit and talk about the earlier period of modern Midrashic studies, which was, as far as I can tell at least, concerned mostly with how the rabbinic texts in general and Midrashic texts in particular might be used to understand the early history of the development of the rabbinic movement, or often you find rabbinic midrash used for comparative purposes for the study of early Christianity. Could you describe what some of those studies were trying to do in using rabbinic literature to interpret, for example, Jesus' sayings in the Gospels and so on and so forth?
Well, it's long been recognized that Midrash is a kind of invaluable repository of historical facts, both about early Judaism and about Christianity. Some of my own work, for example, on the parables in Midrash, I've shown and others have shown before me that Jesus' parables, for example, are part of, in fact, they're not only part of the same tradition as the later parables of the rabbis, they're probably our earliest written evidence for the tradition of parables that one finds in much greater numbers among the rabbis. In my own work on the parable, I've tried to show that certain things that we can deduce from the way the rabbis use parables can also help us understand the way in which Jesus used parables. And that's very important for Christian scholarship, especially because most Christian scholars believe that the parables are probably the closest things that remain of what Jesus actually said. So Midrash has proven to be a very important source for finding out various things about other things: Judaism, Christianity, the Roman Empire, life in the Roman Empire, and so on. Traditionally, Midrash has always been a kind of stepsister of something else. Even in traditional Jewish circles, from the early medieval period on, Midrash has always been relegated to a kind of inferior position vis-a-vis Talmud and the more serious, the more intellectually rigorous, the less imaginative, the more legal branches of Jewish learning. And the first sort of attention that was paid to Midrash was, not surprisingly, to find it in a source for learning about other things and to restore a kind of legitimacy to it. It's only recently, let's say in the last, almost 100 years, since we're getting to the end of this century, that Midrash has begun to be recovered for itself. And really, I guess the first person to do that was Leopold Zuntz in the beginning of the century.
Beginning of the 19th.
Not the beginning of the
19th.
Yeah, the beginning of the 19th century, who really was the first one to point out that Midrash, or the sermon, which is a kind of offshoot of Midrash, is the literature of the Jews. This is where, if one was going to look for
And what he meant by literature was really literature in the grandest sense.
Yeah, in the grandest sense.
The repository of
Galet, yeah, in the grandest sense of the term. Only Zuntz was very significant for making that recognition and for establishing it, really, just by virtue of his own prestige. Within the field of sort of Jewish studies and then of, Hebrew literature, Midrash has slowly began to emerge through the course of the century as a field in its own right. The landmarks would be the places where it began to be studied in departments of Hebrew literature, and primarily in Israel, and and the appearance of a few works which really began to try to look at Midrash on its own terms and understand it on its own terms. In America, there was a completely independent, rather separate development, which was primarily a result of the sort of introduction of post-structuralism. in America and a kind of simultaneous awakening among certain Jewish literary critics. I mean, I think for the most part they were Jewish, in finding sort of models or precursors for post-structuralists, for the new types of literary theory which set themselves up in opposition to the previous types. There was a real desire among these Jewish critics to find Jewish models, you know, and this happened partly as a result of their own awakening as Jews. And this was extremely fortuitous for the study of Midrash, because what happened was that these critics, these literary critics, really brought at least a certain awareness of possibilities of looking at Midrash from new perspectives that really did open up the literature.
So they seem to have taken the study of Midrash away from strictly historical purposes, or actually away from traditional religious
and even
readings
from
and
traditional literary purposes. You know, people 50 years ago, if you asked somebody what literature was, they'd say a poem, a novel. The great contribution of sort of post-structuralist literary theory has been to open up this question of what literature is. And whatever your answer is, whether it's language in general or whether it's, you know, certain types or uses of language and so on, it's really split open this question and allowed for the possibility of looking at many, many different types of writing as forms of literature that previously would not have been admitted to that canon, and for developing techniques and, you know, and methods for appreciating these other types of writing more on their own terms, as, you know, and for looking at them for their literary interest, as I say, in the way they use language.
Well, would it be possible, we have about 5 minutes left, would it be possible to summarize some of the results you see as being most
Well, I think what's
useful
happened
in
is that,
Midrashic
as a result of this, it's really been possible to look at Midrash and not try to force it into looking like a miniature little War and Peace or a kind of miniaturized novel or short story, or talking about it in terms of, you know, sort of aesthetic beauty or other impressionistic terms. But it's been possible to sort of look at it and really to appreciate what are in fact its distinctive features, which are the way it blends interpretation and narrative or other types of writing. The way in which the very process of interpretation comes to the fore, and for seeing what the process of interpretation as it's illustrated in Midrash can tell us about the nature of the rabbis, about their minds, about what concerned them, about its use as a religious activity, you know, about how a religious activity could also be a form of entertainment or of art. These are, I think, sort of the largest contributions that that Midrash has, sort of this new application of literary theory to Midrash has enabled.
Well, how would you describe, you brought this up, how would you describe the relationship, the religious relationship between the Midrashic interpreter and the biblical text? How is that relationship illumined from the perspective of these new theoretical developments, for example?
It's illuminated, well, what one really sees is the way in which interpretation itself becomes a kind of religious activity. It's often said that in Judaism, study is an activity. That's true. What Midrash adds to it and is the fact that the unique characteristic of Midrash, and this is what makes it typical of, I think, Rabbinic Judaism, is that in terms of its form, its literary form, it's very, very organized, very, very structured, highly structured. In terms of its, as it were, inner life, it's very difficult to define, to fix, to systematize. The most frequently asked question about Midrash is, well, what doesn't go? What interpretation wouldn't make it? And except for some fairly obvious examples, interpreting verses in Isaiah, not only messianically, but referring, say, to the Christ, to Jesus, that wouldn't go. That wouldn't go. But apart from sort of some very clear examples, interpreting verses in the Bible is referring to multiple gods in heaven, not to one. Apart from those clear examples, in fact, it's very hard to say what wouldn't go. And in fact, I'm not sure that it will ever really be possible to systematize it. I don't think the rabbis are interested in systematizing. That the inner life is always actually very free playing. On the other hand, the outside structure is extraordinarily organized. The language is very highly organized, very structured. And it's that combination of sort of high external order, organization, and sort of inner playfulness, freedom, unsystematic, letting go, which in general I think is very typical of the religious spirit of the rabbis.
It sounds very much like halakhic Judaism, actually.
And yeah, exactly, of halakhic Judaism.
Well, thank you very much, David. This has been very illuminating. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank David Stern for being with us. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.